gear seekers, I'm Nick. The 5700 XT has been out for a few months now, and we've seen some really good partner cards and some not so good partner cards. ASRock sent over their brand new 5700 XT TAICHI OC Plus edition for us to check out and for us to use in a couple builds, so I decided it was probably the perfect time to see how it performed in our regular suite of benchmarks. With one twist though. By popular demand, we've started testing all of our GPUs in Linux 2 with a new suite of Linux benchmarks. So from now on, if you're a Linux user, we're going to look after you guys as well. Before we start, there's a stack of other channels who've already dived into this card, so before you ask why we didn't do something, I don't really want to reinvent the wheel, so I'll put a link to my mate Steve from Hardware Unboxed video in the top right hand corner right now. And yeah, you can see what he said about the card, just in case there's something that we didn't answer in this video. We're using our new GPU test system, which is on the Gigabyte Z390 Aorus Ultra with an i7-8700K with 16 gigs of Team Group Dark Z at 3600 MHz. We actually did a full build video of our new testing hardware, and it's also our new Linux test bench as well. And you can check out that video in the top right hand corner now if you haven't seen that yet. Otherwise, just keep watching. We included some other cards we've tested recently to give the TAICHI 5700 XT Plus a little bit of context. We also tested every single GPU that we have on hand at the moment in Linux 2, so our Linux testing also has a little bit of context. Now, this process took us about 2 days. It was a lot of work, and that's kind of the reason why we missed that upload day in the middle of these videos. Now, we don't include 1% highs or low with these tests because for us, and the amount of testing we already do now with 2 different types of operating systems, yeah, it just takes too much time, and getting an average frame rate gives you a good indication of the expected performance anyways. With all that said, let's start off with the Windows testing. We use these benchmarks for every single GPU benchmarking video, so you can go to any of our other GPU videos on the whole channel and see how this GPU stacks up with any other GPU that we've tested. Now, we like to use testing that's repeatable, and we like to use standardized testing and not gameplay testing because any gameplay testing results can't be repeated and they just have way too many variables, and ultimately they're pretty unreliable. We want the only variable in all of these testing just to be the GPU and nothing else, not like a certain part on a map which gives you a lower frame rate. We want to give you the best repeatable results. And I know some people don't like the way we do it, but too bad, that's how we do it. And it's accurate and it's repeatable. So with that said, let's kick off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. For the 1080p test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 134 frames per second. For the 1440p test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 96 frames per second. For the 4K test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 53 frames per second. Let's move on to UNIGINE superposition. For the superposition test, we performed 3 tests in total. We used the 4K optimized preset, the 1080p extreme preset, and a custom 1440p preset with depth of field and motion blur disabled. For the 1440p custom test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 121 frames per second. For the 4K optimized test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 56 frames per second. For the 1080p extreme test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 40 frames per second. The last batch of Windows tests is with the Final Fantasy 15 benchmarking tool. This is an updated version of the tool with a lot more optimizations to make this a far more accurate benchmarking tool. For the 1080p test, we saw the TAICHI render a total amount of 10,602 frames. For the 1440p test, we saw the TAICHI render a total amount of 7,411 frames. For the 4K test, we saw the TAICHI render a total amount of 4,177 frames. In Windows, the TAICHI is looking like it's performing only slightly better than the reference 5700 XT that AMD sent us. Now, with all the Windows testing out of the way, let's do some Linux testing. Now, we're fortunate because a few weeks ago, Shadow of the Tomb Raider was released on Linux and it runs in Vulkan. And we're also using UNIGINE superposition for our testing. There's also a Linux version of that. And although it only uses OpenGL and doesn't perform as well as the Windows DX 11 version, yeah, it's highly repeatable, so it actually makes for a pretty decent benchmark. And because there's no Linux version of the Final Fantasy 15 benchmarking tool, we opted to use a new benchmark. And also, it's a benchmark that has really highly repeatable results and it uses Vulkan. So we went with BASEMARK. Now, I wanted to run through some of the parameters of our Linux testing environment because I'm sure there's going to be some questions about that stuff. We're running Ubuntu 18.04.3 with an upgraded version of the kernel running version 5.3.12. We tested everything with both open source AMD drivers and proprietary drivers with the same results with the kernel 5.3.12. And yeah, all of our NVIDIA testing was run with NVIDIA's proprietary drivers. Now, I just wanted to say this as well. The reason why it performs the same with the AMD proprietary and open source drivers is because of Vulkan. And yeah, we'll actually come back to this in another video. I don't want to waste too much time. So with all that, let's start off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. For the 1080p test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 122 frames per second. For the 1440p test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 93 frames per second. For the 4K test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 52 frames per second. The Linux version of Shadow of the Tomb Raider is pretty optimized, so the GPU-intensive resolutions of 1440p and 4K saw basically the same performance as its Windows counterpart. And to me, for a Linux port, that's pretty impressive. Let's move on to superposition. We use the same three tests that we do with the Windows version: 4K optimized, 1080p extreme, and a custom 1440p preset with depth of field and motion blur disabled. Let's see what happened. For the 1440p custom test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 84 frames per second. For the 4K optimized test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 42 frames per second. For the 1080p extreme, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 32 frames per second. If you're new to Linux and you're wondering why the results are far lower than superposition on Windows, it's to do with how the port was created by translating DX11 calls to OpenGL, which takes up more CPU cycles, and it's also the fact that it's running on OpenGL and not Vulkan. The API really does make a huge difference with these tests. Okay, let's move on to BASEMARK GPU. BASEMARK GPU is a benchmarking utility for Linux and Windows that is available from their website. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out for yourself. Now, BASEMARK gives us a great indication of Vulkan performance since the 3D engine it uses has been designed with low-level Vulkan API calls to really take advantage of your 3D hardware. The other interesting thing about BASEMARK as well is the fact that it's multi-platform, which means we're actually probably going to start to use it for Windows Vulkan benchmarking as well. Not only that, they're bringing stuff like ray tracing, multi-GPU benchmarking, and to me, it makes it pretty interesting, and it actually solves a problem that I didn't know that I had. Anyways, let's see how the TAICHI did. We performed all of the tests with the high preset. For the 1080p test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 160 frames per second. For the 1440p test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 123 frames per second. For the 4K test, we saw the TAICHI get an average score of 74 frames per second. Now, I wanted to talk about the card itself. The TAICHI has a BIOS switch which allows you to switch between having the card in its OC state or in a silent state. So if you wanted to know, all of the testing was done in the OC state. The GPU fans, when the GPU hit 100% of sustained load, were audible, but they weren't much louder than any other GPUs on the market. There's a little bit of core whine, but if you had this card installed inside of a proper system and not on an open air test bench like we had, it'd be pretty quiet. And I didn't do extensive thermal testing because, to be honest, the amount of time that I spent putting this video together, it just didn't give me any more time to do anything else. Now, I did make a few observations though, because I know someone's gonna ask, with the Windows testing, I saw the card max out at around 71 degrees Celsius in our 18-degree ambient office. And yeah, that's pretty acceptable for a 5700 XT. But like I said, I didn't sit around testing any thermal stuff. The ASRock 5700 XT OC Plus is going for around 800 Australian dollars. Wow, that's a lot for a 5700 XT when I say that out loud. Wow. And yeah, 485 US dollars at the time of filming this video. That's really an expensive GPU. Wow. Anyway, there's a link in the description down below if you wanted to grab one of these cards for yourself. Also, before we wrap this video up, I feel like I have to say this. I decided to include all of the Linux testing in this video because the card's been out for a little while now and I wanted to have all of the information in one place. I think in the future though, with like other GPU videos, I'll do separate Windows and Linux versions because usually when we get drivers that are pre-released for GPUs before the GPUs actually release, they're only Windows drivers. And yeah, we usually have to wait till launch to get the Linux drivers or some type of driver that will work in Linux. So yeah, we'll probably just split them up into 2 videos because of that reason alone. But yeah, let us know if you prefer them to be in one video or a video just for Windows and one just for Linux. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. If you didn't like this video, you know what to do and tell us what you hated about it. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. I'm your boy Nick with Gear Seekers. You peek, we seek. And you know what's crazy, Claire?
What?
When I was like reading the script just now and I looked at the price of the 5700 XT in Australia, I realized it's very expensive for the ASRock version.
Just a little.
I'm not going to comment on it because I don't know why it's more expensive, but you know, I think Steve probably answered all this in his video. So if I didn't answer something, go and watch Steve's video. He's a good bloke and he'll look after you with all that info. Thanks for watching.